Good evening, sleepyheads. Tonight we bring you an unlikely friendship for the ages, where kindness met conquest, and somehow it worked. Genghis Khan and Mr. Rogers. One, a warlord who once ruled the largest land empire in human history. The other, a soft-spoken television neighbor in a red cardigan. It sounds impossible, but somehow, through a swirl of cosmic nonsense and cardigan-level compassion, they meet. What follows includes horseback rides through quiet suburbs, juice-box diplomacy, gentle talks about fear and forgiveness, and at least one horse who never quite understood any of it. Welcome back to Bedside Biographies and another chapter in our Unlikely Friendships for Sleep series. A soothing blend of imagination and history, where legends from different worlds meet and become the friends you never expected. Each story is rooted in real history, sprinkled with warmth and wonder, crafted to help you wind down, drift off, and maybe even smile in your sleep. If these stories bring peace to your night, a small click on like and subscribe means the world to us and helps us keep creating more. And tell us in the comments where and when you're listening from. We love seeing our global circle of dreamers growing each night. So take a breath, let the stars settle overhead, and let the noise of the world fade as you fall asleep to one of the most unlikely friendships, the kind that never happened until now. The Warlord and the Welcome Mat. It was a peaceful morning on Beechwood Avenue. The sun had just begun to filter through the trees in dappled patches, and the air smelled faintly of grass clippings and distant toast. A sprinkler clicked rhythmically in one yard. A golden retriever barked twice, just to remind the neighborhood he still had opinions. It was the kind of street where you could hear a screen door sigh open and no coffee was brewing. So no one quite knew what to make of the man in armor. He stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, perfectly still, like a misplaced statue. Leather boots streaked with dry mud. A wolf fur cape that stirred slightly in the breeze. His helmet, conical, burnished, caught the sun like something forged in another world. In his right hand, he held a curved sword. In his left, a mailbox. He had ripped it from the ground like a trophy. He didn't know what it was, but it seemed important. Possibly sacred, possibly a challenge. Several birds watched from a nearby fence post with mild interest. A jogger passed by, slowed down, looked twice, then sped up and decided maybe today wasn't the day for cardio. The man was Genghis Khan, and he was lost. It had started, as these things often do, with thunder that wasn't thunder and a light in the sky that wasn't the sun. Genghis, standing tall in the windswept grasslands of 13th century Mongolia, had been discussing siege tactics when the clouds above him opened like a curtain. There was no time to draw a weapon, no time to pray. He fell into the light with a noise that was part growl, part question. Then, this, a quiet street, a strange sky, shrubs shaped like animals. He sniffed the air. No horses, no blood, no smoke, only something yeasty and warm. He raised his sword cautiously as a garage door opened across the street. Fred Rogers, cardigan freshly zipped, sneakers clean, hands tucked gently into his pockets, stepped out into the driveway and smiled. "Hello there," Mr. Rogers said gently, as if he were greeting a squirrel or a very determined UPS driver. "Are you looking for something?" Genghis grunted. His eyes scanned for potential threats. None of the houses had visible archers. The closest thing to a fortress appeared to be a mailbox cluster bolted into a cement pad. "Do you have a name?" Mr. Rogers asked, walking slowly across the lawn, one soft step at a time. Sometimes names can help when we feel far from home. Genghis said something in Mongolian that translated, very roughly, to, "I am the punishment of heaven, sent to chastise the world." Fred Rogers tilted his head slightly, smiled with complete sincerity, and said, "That's a very powerful name. You must have a very big heart." The warlord blinked. He had ridden through blizzards, crossed rivers on horseback, conquered dynasties, but he had never been looked at like that before. Not with fear, not with awe. Just kindness. Fred gestured gently toward his house. "Would you like to come inside? It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood." Genghis didn't move. His grip tightened on the mailbox. Fred paused. "You can keep that if it helps," he said, nodding toward the object in Genghis's hand. "Some things are easier to face when we're holding on to something familiar." After a long pause, Genghis stepped forward, slowly, like approaching a wild animal or a trap that hadn't quite been sprung. The mailbox came with him, trailing a clump of dirt and a piece of grass still clinging to its pole. Inside the house, the air was warm and smelled of cinnamon and dust jackets. Books lined the shelves like quiet sentries. A trolley track ran along the edge of the living room. Genghis looked around the room with the wary curiosity of a man used to checking for boiling oil. Fred moved with his usual unhurried grace. "Would you like to sit?" Genghis remained standing. "Where are your guards?" Fred walked to the kitchen. "Just me today." Genghis followed. He scanned the cupboards, the ceiling, the corners. No sentries, no weapons, no traps. "Nope," Fred said, pouring tea. "Just chamomile." Genghis studied the steam rising from the mug like it might be a spirit. Fred handed it to him. "It's calming, helps with long journeys." Genghis sniffed it, sipped, frowned. "Tastes like surrender." Fred chuckled. "Sometimes surrender is how we find peace." Genghis sat. The chair creaked under his weight. His armor scratched against the cushion. He looked around the table, taking stock. Placemats, a bowl of fruit, a framed photograph of Fred with a goldfish. He set the mailbox carefully on the floor beside him, like a ceremonial spear. They sat for a moment in quiet. Outside, a lawnmower buzzed faintly in the distance. Inside, the grandfather clock ticked like a heartbeat. "I've conquered lands," Genghis said at last. "I believe you," Fred replied. "I've sacked cities. I'm sure they were well defended. I once rode across a river of ice to surprise a dynasty." Fred smiled gently. "That sounds daring." Genghis blinked again. "You're not afraid of me?" Fred considered the question. "I think fear is a feeling, and feelings are something we can talk about." Genghis squinted at him. "You speak in riddles." "I speak in feelings," Fred said, standing and walking toward a closet. He opened it to reveal a rainbow of cardigans, all neatly hung and arranged by season. "Would you like something more comfortable than armor?" Genghis rose. "I do not remove armor in enemy territory." Fred nodded, then reached to a nearby shelf and returned with something else. A small, knitted square. "This is for your hand," he said, offering it gently. Genghis examined the item. It was soft, patterned in simple stripes and utterly unfamiliar. He turned it over, ran his thumb across the yarn, then looked up. "It is not a weapon." "No," Fred replied. "It's a comfort square. Something to hold on to when you're somewhere new." Genghis sat again, holding the small knit patch with both hands like it might dissolve if he squeezed too hard. He didn't speak, but his fingers curled around it. Fred set a plate of toast on the table. "Your bread is soft," Genghis observed. "It's store-bought," Fred said. "I once had to eat leather." Fred nodded thoughtfully. Some days are harder than others. Then, in a soft voice, "Why am I here?" Fred looked out the window. "Maybe the universe knew you needed a neighbor." Genghis looked down at the toast. "I don't know what that is." Fred reached over and gently tapped his own chest. "It's someone who welcomes you just the way you are." Genghis looked up. "Even if I've burned villages?" Fred looked back. "Especially then." And in that moment, something loosened behind the warlord's eyes. Just a little. That evening, they sat in the living room. Fred tuned the radio to a classical station. Genghis sat across from him, now barefoot and robe-draped, the slippers making quiet scuffing noises on the hardwood floor. Fred was knitting. Genghis was watching the goldfish. "They don't blink," he said suddenly. "No," Fred replied, "but they're excellent listeners." Genghis leaned closer to the goldfish tank, peering into the gentle swirl of tiny fins and filtered bubbles. The fish moved lazily, unaffected by his presence. "I told them about the Northern Campaign," he said, half to himself. "The long march through the frost, the river ambush." They seemed unimpressed. Fred smiled without looking up from his knitting. Maybe they're just taking it in. Genghis tilted his head. "They are not warriors." "No," Fred replied. "They're just present." Genghis caught sight of his own reflection in the tank glass, the faint outline of a warlord in borrowed slippers. His voice dropped to a murmur. "I used to be only war." Fred paused. "And now?" Genghis didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. So they sat, two men from impossibly different worlds, wrapped in the quiet hum of a suburban living room. The clock ticked, the goldfish circled. The tea grew cooler in their hands. For once, there was no conquest to plan, no village to burn, just the soft comfort of shared silence. Outside, the stars began to come out. Slippers and spoons. The kitchen was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional whisper of birdsong outside. Mr. Rogers moved with the kind of calm that made time itself slow down. He opened a cabinet, reached for 2 mugs, and placed them gently on the counter. One had a smiling sun on it, the other read, "You are special." Genghis Khan was seated at the round breakfast table like a man awaiting interrogation. His wolf fur cape was draped over the back of the chair, his helmet resting on the floor beside him like a loyal dog. In front of him, a bowl of oatmeal steamed patiently, untouched. He stared at the spoon Fred had offered him, turning it in his hand like it might transform into a weapon or whisper a secret. Fred sat across from him with his own bowl, calmly spooning oats into his mouth. "This is not gruel," Genghis said at last. "No," Fred replied, smiling. "It's oatmeal. I added some brown sugar and cinnamon. warlord sniffed the bowl again. "It is warm, like a horse's breath." Fred nodded thoughtfully. "That's a lovely way to put it." Slowly, with the precision of a man disarming a trap, Genghis dipped the spoon and brought it to his mouth. He chewed, swallowed, paused, his eyes narrowed. "It does not fight back," he said. "Is that good or bad?" Fred asked gently. Genghis leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight. Unclear. A few minutes later, Fred stood and walked to a small closet near the hallway. He opened it with a soft creak, revealing neat rows of cardigans and shoes, a vacuum cleaner, and a wicker basket at the bottom. He returned with something in his hands. 2 large grey slippers, wool-lined, slightly worn, and shaped like they'd been designed by someone who wanted your feet to forgive the world. "These are for you," Fred said, holding them out like sacred offerings. Genghis accepted them wordlessly. He turned them over, sniffed them, knocked them together like coconuts. Finally, he slipped off his boots and eased his calloused feet into the slippers. He didn't say anything for a long time. Fred went back to the table, sipping tea, reading a book about tree frogs. He didn't push. He didn't prod. He just waited. Finally, Genghis looked up. "My feet are confused," he said. Fred smiled. "That's okay. They'll adjust." They sat like that for a while. A warlord and a cardiganed neighbor, both wearing slippers, both quietly sipping tea. Outside, a school bus passed. A dog barked again. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. Genghis rose and wandered into the living room. He moved like a bear, trying not to creak the floorboards. The fish tank in the corner caught his eye. He stood in front of it, arms crossed, studying the small, shimmering creatures inside. Fred joined him. "These are my goldfish. That one's Henrietta. The orange one is Peach, and the one hiding in the cave is Greg." Genghis narrowed his eyes. "They are quiet." "They listen well," Fred said. "They are spies," Genghis muttered. Fred chuckled. "You're welcome to feed them." Genghis took the small container of flakes like it was a vial of powdered danger. He sprinkled it over the tank with the grace of a priest blessing the dead. The fish rose eagerly. "They do not fight over food," he noted. "They share," Fred replied. The warlord looked skeptical. Then came the doorbell. Genghis tensed instantly, his hand twitching toward his belt, though Fred had gently suggested he leave most of his weaponry in the umbrella stand by the door. Fred placed a calming hand on his arm. "It's just a package. Probably books or socks." He walked to the front door, opened it, and greeted the delivery person with his usual warmth. Genghis peeked from the hallway like a sentry guarding a sacred temple. The package was signed for. The world had not ended. Fred set the box on the kitchen counter and turned. "Would you like to help me open it?" Genghis stepped forward, still in slippers, still wary. Fred handed him a small letter opener, nothing too threatening. The warlord sliced the tape with elegant precision, lifted the flaps, and peered inside. He frowned. "Foam worms." Fred laughed. "Packing peanuts. They keep things from breaking." Genghis reached in, withdrew the item, an instructional DVD on mindfulness, and turned it over in his hands. "This teaches warriors to breathe slowly. Fred nodded. More or less. Genghis set the DVD down with great reverence. Your world is soft, but not weak. Fred didn't answer. He didn't need to. Later that day, they sat on the couch. Fred was knitting a tiny red scarf for one of the puppets. Genghis was reading a picture book titled Everyone Feels Things. He turned the pages with slow caution, stopping occasionally to raise an eyebrow or grunt in confusion. This bear, he said, pointing to the illustration, is angry because no one listened. Fred looked up. That happens sometimes. But the bear does not kill anyone. No, Fred said. He talks about his feelings. Genghis exhaled slowly. Your bears are wise. The sun dipped lower. The goldfish glowed like tiny lanterns. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor mowed their lawn. Fred stood and walked to the record player. He selected a vinyl with gentle piano melodies and placed the needle. The music drifted through the room like a memory you hadn't earned yet. Genghis listened, hands folded in his lap, eyes half closed. After a while, he whispered, "You fight with music?" Fred smiled softly. Sometimes it's the only thing strong enough. They didn't speak after that. They just sat. One man who had conquered empires and another who had conquered 4-year-olds' hearts. Both in that moment at peace. Even if neither of them quite understood why. Daniel the tiger, meet the Khan. Fred kept the puppets on a shelf just above the goldfish tank. It wasn't labeled, but it might as well have read, "Sacred Relics of Emotional Intelligence." There were half a dozen of them, fuzzy friends with big eyes and names that echoed down generations. King Friday the 13th, Henrietta Pussycat, X the Owl, and of course, Daniel Tiger. Fred pulled one down gently. Daniel, his favorite. He turned and offered it to Genghis Khan like one might hand over a ceremonial dagger. The warlord stared. "What is this?" he asked. "He's a puppet," Fred replied. "A way to help children understand feelings." Genghis turned Daniel over in his hand. "He is light, poorly armored. He's soft on purpose." The puppet's fabric whispered as Genghis squeezed it slightly. Then, with the casual grace of a man who had once declared war by messenger falcon, he slid Daniel onto his hand. "Does he have a battle name?" Genghis asked. "Well, he's Daniel Tiger," Fred said, "but you're welcome to rename him." Genghis's voice dropped into something deeper, graver. "Then I name him Khan Daniel. He speaks for me now." Fred didn't laugh. He simply nodded with respect. "I think he'll do a fine job." The puppet turned. Genghis flexed his hand, making the little tiger raise an arm. "Today," Khan Daniel said, "we conquer fear with kindness." Fred clapped gently. "That's a beautiful lesson." Genghis nodded solemnly, still speaking through the puppet. "And afterward, we eat crackers." It became a tradition. Every morning after tea, while the oatmeal cooled and the slippers warmed, Genghis and Fred would sit by the goldfish tank and take turns voicing the puppets. Genghis found a particular affinity for Lady Elaine, whose chaotic energy reminded him of a Mongol general he once trusted with 3 provinces and a yak farm. She defies all structure, Genghis said with admiration. She has no fear. Fred smiled. She's a little misunderstood. The puppet episodes weren't scripted. They simply happened. Once, Genghis used King Friday to declare martial law over the kitchen. Another time, Daniel gave a monologue on dental hygiene so stirring it nearly moved Fred to tears. Fred never judged. He just listened, reacted with a nod, offered a warm, "That was brave," or "I like how you handled that." But not every moment was peaceful. One morning, while Fred was folding laundry, Genghis discovered the vacuum cleaner. It was standing quietly in the hall closet, like an upright beast waiting to be roused. He dragged it out with suspicion, studying its plastic hide and coiled cord. He pressed a button, and the machine roared to life. Within seconds, Genghis had drawn the wooden back scratcher Fred kept near the armchair and was engaging the vacuum in what he later called an honorable duel. Fred rounded the corner to find his guest swinging wildly, the vacuum zigzagging across the carpet in confused rebellion. The back scratcher broke. The vacuum's hose sucked in the curtain hem. "Is it slain?" Genghis panted when the switch was finally flipped off. Fred surveyed the damage. "Temporarily." After a quiet moment, Fred opened a cabinet and handed Genghis a granola bar. They sat on the couch, both a little breathless. "You were very brave," Fred said gently. Genghis unwrapped the bar like it might bite him. It roared without breath. "That's kinda what vacuums do. I would like to rename it," Genghis said. "Its spirit is wild. It shall be known as Suction Beast." Fred nodded. A fitting title. Another time, Fred brought out an old photo album. Inside were faded pictures of his own childhood. Freddie Rogers in high socks and summer shorts, holding ice cream, petting a dog, posing beside a toy trolley. "This was before the show," Fred said, flipping a page. "Back when I was just someone's little boy." Genghis leaned in. "You had a face like a cloud. Gentle, but unpredictable." Fred laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." He flipped another page. This one had a photo of Fred's parents. A picnic. Laughter caught mid-bite. "Are they still here?" Genghis asked. Fred shook his head. "Number, but they taught me many things that still are." Genghis sat quietly for a moment. "My father was poisoned when I was 9. Fred didn't flinch. "That must have been hard. I was captured soon after. Escaped, hid in hills." Genghis's voice was steady, like reciting a campfire tale. "I once lived on roots and horse milk for a month." Fred closed the album. "You've survived much." Genghis looked at the goldfish tank. "But survival is not peace." "No," Fred said, "but it's the start of it." That afternoon, they sat outside on the porch. Fred wore his favorite cardigan. Genghis had draped a towel over his shoulders like a makeshift cloak. The sun filtered through maple leaves, and the smell of fresh-cut grass hung in the air. A neighbor waved from across the street. Genghis raised a mug in return. "I have not raised a single village since I arrived," he said proudly. Fred chuckled. "That's called progress." Genghis sipped his tea. "It is chamomile, the flavor of surrender." They watched the street in silence for a few moments. Then Genghis asked, "Will I return to my time?" Fred didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at the sky. "I don't know," he said at last. "But maybe time isn't the only thing that matters." Genghis considered that. "Then what does?" Fred smiled gently. "What we do with it." And that too became a ritual, asking unanswerable questions under the lazy sway of wind chimes. It didn't matter if Genghis ever found his way back, or if he understood the fish, or the vacuum, or the curious magic of a puppet tiger's small felt paw. What mattered was that in one quiet neighborhood, for one impossible season, the world's most fearsome conqueror was learning to say please, to wear soft slippers, and to ask himself why silence sometimes felt safer than shouting. He was still Genghis Khan, but he was becoming something else too. Trolley trouble and toothbrushes. The morning began with a lesson in oral hygiene. Fred Rogers stood beside Genghis Khan in the bathroom, both of them facing the mirror like weary comrades before battle. Fred wore a peaceful smile. Genghis held the toothbrush like it was a training dagger. "This," Fred said gently, "is a toothbrush." Genghis turned it over in his hand. It was suspiciously lightweight. No blade. No grip for two hands. It's poorly constructed. "It's not for battle," Fred explained. "It's for your teeth." Genghis scowled at his reflection. "I have chewed bark and bone for decades. My teeth are strong. They can still be clean." With slow, deliberate movements, Fred brushed his own teeth. Soft, circular strokes, calm as clouds. Genghis watched. Then, gripping his brush like a sword, he attacked his molars with ferocity. Foam exploded. The mirror caught collateral damage. A hand towel fell from its rack in surrender. Fred passed him another towel without judgment. "Is bleeding expected?" Genghis asked. "Only at first," Fred said. "Then it gets better." Genghis grinned, showing sudsy teeth. "Then I'm making excellent progress." That afternoon, Fred had a taping at the PBS studio. Genghis insisted on joining. "I must see the battlefield where you rule," he said. Fred chuckled. "It's not quite a battlefield." Still, Genghis dressed with care, slippers, tunic, and despite Fred's polite discouragement, his ceremonial belt with a sheathed blade. "I go nowhere unarmed," he said, "even if the enemy is invisible." They arrived at the studio, where a crew member immediately spilled coffee at the sight of the towering warlord beside Fred. Fred gave a gentle wave. "It's all right. He's not in SAG-AFTRA. He's visiting." The assistant director leaned close. "Fred, who is this?" "This is Genghis," Fred replied warmly. "My friend from another time." The AD blinked. "Cool." The set was lit like a child's dream, a small brick house with a porch swing, cardboard trees, and of course, the red neighborhood trolley track. Genghis's eyes narrowed. "It has no horses," he said. "Nope," Fred replied. "It runs on electricity." Genghis crouched by the track, tapped it. "It hums." He glanced up at a blinking red light on a camera. "What is that?" Fred looked at the lens. "That's the camera. It helps us see in a different way." Genghis scowled. "It watches me?" Fred nodded gently. "It watches us." for the children. Genghis straightened. So they send their smallest warriors to observe? Well, to learn. He circled the trolley once, touched its roof. Is this your steed? Fred laughed. It's more like a guide. Then Fred went behind the curtain to get his shoes changed. When he returned, Genghis was seated in the middle of the set, puppet Daniel Tiger on his hand, delivering a stirring monologue to a completely silent crew. I am Khan Daniel, he bellowed, and today I face the kingdom of uncertainty. I demand answers and apple slices. A boom mic quivered. In the control room, someone whispered, "Keep rolling." Whatever this is, it's gold. Fred stepped calmly into frame. And today, we're learning about boundaries. They filmed a short segment on sharing. Genghis was confused but cooperative. In one shot, Fred offered him a small cup of juice. Genghis held it up like a ceremonial chalice. I accept this offering in peace. Later, in the editing bay, Fred showed Genghis the raw footage. Dozens of screens glowed with soft loops, Fred tying shoes, waving, opening doors, feeding fish. Genghis leaned forward. You lead your people through gestures. Fred nodded. Sometimes quiet things speak the loudest. Genghis pointed. You rule them with cardigans. Fred smiled. They're comfortable. There was silence as Genghis watched a loop of Fred singing the song about being special. He asked softly, You have no army? Fred paused. No army, just friends. Genghis nodded. You're more dangerous than I thought. That evening, back at the house, Fred brewed chamomile. Genghis sat on the porch beside him, Daniel Puppet still on one hand, blade on his hip. The camera. It sees everything? Genghis asked. Fred sipped his tea. Only what you let it. Genghis raised his mug. Then today, it saw peace. Fred clinked mugs with him. And I, Genghis added with surprising gentleness, saw a kind of power I had never known. Lights, camera, conquest. The morning began with toast, thick slices, barely buttered, precisely jammed. Raspberry, Fred's favorite. He worked slowly, carefully, like each stroke of the knife was part of a larger peace treaty. Across the table, Genghis Khan watched him with the same suspicion he'd once reserved for rival Khans. I have to film an episode today, Fred said casually, as if announcing a trip to the post office. You're welcome to come along. Genghis blinked. His mustache twitched. Is this a trial? Fred smiled softly. No, it's a television show for children. The warlord tilted his head. We put children on trial. No, Fred said quickly, gently, buttering with more intent. We help them grow, understand things, feel safe. Genghis chewed this over. Is there a sword demonstration? Not exactly. Fred sipped his tea. But there is a trolley. That sealed it. They drove in Fred's modest sedan, the kind that looked like it might apologize if it cut someone off. Genghis sat stiffly in the passenger seat, gripping the handle above the door as if the car might lurch into battle at any moment. He wore his usual tunic, a belt of non-weapons securely fastened at the waist. though it still jingled faintly with what might have once been a flail. His slippers, reluctantly accepted that morning, tapped nervously against the floor mat. Fred drove calmly, humming to the radio. "You trust this chariot," Genghis muttered, eyes darting to a passing garbage truck, "even though it has no horses." Fred glanced over. "It's reliable, and we have seatbelts." Genghis nodded slowly. "Like armor, for your ribs." When they pulled up to the PBS studio, Genghis exited the vehicle like a conqueror landing in a new province. The building itself was unassuming. Low brick walls, a faded awning, and a weathered sign that read, "Public Broadcasting Service." But inside, the air buzzed with purpose. Wires crisscrossed the floor, lights dangled like fruit from mechanical trees. Voices murmured urgently into headsets. Genghis narrowed his eyes. A war council? More like a family of storytellers, Fred said, handing him a name badge that read, "Visitor Genghis." Genghis turned it over. "A sigil?" "A welcome," Fred said. Inside, the studio unfolded like a miniature kingdom. There were painted backdrops, soundproof curtains, puppet stages, and the unmistakable track of the neighborhood trolley. Fred moved through it like a gardener in his own greenhouse, soft-footed, nodding to each crew member by name. Genghis followed close behind, his gaze flicking to every shadow, every blinking red camera light. A young assistant producer in a hoodie nearly dropped his clipboard at the sight of Genghis's wolf fur cape. Fred waved. "This is my friend. He's shadowing me today." The producer stammered. "Is he armed?" "Spiritually," Fred replied. The wardrobe corner was lined with cardigans, every shade. Genghis paused before them, brow furrowed. "Do these grant rank?" Fred chuckled. "Not rank. Comfort." He selected his usual red sweater and began to change. There was something ceremonial about it. The shoes, too, swapped for indoor sneakers with quiet reverence. Genghis watched this preparation with interest. "So, you're not a priest?" "No, not a general." Fred zipped the cardigan gently, closer to a neighbor. The stage lights warmed. A red tally light lit up. The cameras hummed to life. Fred stepped into view, the backdrop of his familiar home behind him. He stood on the rug, adjusted his sweater, and looked into the lens. "Hello, neighbor," he said with practiced ease. Behind the cameras, Genghis stood frozen. The lens stared back, unblinking, impassive. He didn't trust it. "Who does he address?" he whispered to a nearby grip. "The viewers," the grip replied. "At home, kids mostly." "Children?" Genghis repeated, disturbed. "So this magic box is his army?" The grip hesitated. "Kind of." Fred moved through the opening monologue smoothly. He spoke about imagination, about making paper flowers, about how sometimes when we feel scared, it helps to name what we're feeling. Genghis listened, arms crossed. "He sings," he muttered, "before battle." Then came the trolley. It rolled out with a soft ding. Genghis's eyes followed it like a hawk spotting prey. The tiny car hummed along its track, passing model trees and paper clouds. Slowly, he stepped forward. Fred paused mid-sentence as the hulking figure of Genghis Khan entered the shot, crouching beside the trolley. The cameras kept rolling. "He has no horses," Genghis whispered, examining the wheels. "And yet he moves." Fred kept his voice even. "This is our neighborhood trolley." Genghis pointed at it. "It sings a battle cry. It sings a welcome." The puppet stage waited behind them. Fred approached it with the same gentle energy he used for all thresholds. Genghis followed reluctantly. A row of puppets rested on a shelf. King Friday, Lady Aberlin, X the Owl, Daniel the Tiger. Genghis eyed them like ceremonial masks. "This one," he said, lifting Daniel. "He has a warrior's soul." Fred smiled. "He's brave and curious. I will speak for him." And so, unprompted, Genghis Khan walked back onto the stage. He faced the camera, Daniel on one hand, sword still strapped at his side. "I am Khan Daniel," the puppet said in a gravelly imitation of Genghis's voice, "and I come in search of feelings." The control room went silent. Fred, quick on his feet, popped up from behind the trolley set. He held X the Owl. "Hello, Khan Daniel," X said softly. "What do you feel today?" Genghis blinked. Daniel replied, confused and maybe a little itchy. Fred nodded, keeping the scene alive. "Itchy's okay. We all have days like that." The crew watched, stunned, as a medieval warlord and a cardiganed host improvised a puppet sketch about emotional literacy. Later in the editing bay, Fred showed Genghis the monitor wall. Footage looped gently. Fred tying his shoes, waving goodbye, pouring juice. "This is how you teach?" Genghis asked. Fred nodded. "No armies, no shouting, just shoes and puppets," Fred said. Genghis leaned closer. "You may be more dangerous than I thought." By evening, the studio had quieted. Most of the crew had gone home. Genghis stood alone on the set, staring at the trolley. Fred approached with a mug of chamomile tea. "I have destroyed cities," Genghis murmured, not turning, "and they feared me." Fred offered the tea. "And you're still learning to be heard." Genghis accepted the cup. He sipped. "This has hints of surrender." Fred smiled. "It's relaxing." They stood in silence. One of them once ruled the largest land empire in history. The other just helped children name their emotions. But in the quiet hum of stage lights and soft carpet, they were equals. The drive home was mostly quiet. Fred turned on the radio. Soft jazz. Genghis didn't protest this time. He tapped one finger against the door handle, keeping time. "This land," Genghis said eventually, "it has no walls." "No," Fred replied, "just boundaries and kindness." The car rolled gently down the suburban street. And somewhere behind them, in a studio where cameras still blinked and puppets still waited, a tape was already labeled. Episode 1287, Feelings, Trolleys, and Khan Daniel. Slippers, Swords, and Civic Duty. Setting, the community center and local library. The morning began with the sound of birds. some real, some from the ambient CD Fred occasionally played while making breakfast. Genghis was already awake, standing motionless by the window in his now well-worn slippers, peering through the curtains like a warlord scoping out new territory. Fred, humming gently as he toasted a bagel, asked without turning around, "Are you expecting someone?" Genghis didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head. There is a gathering across the road. 3 older women with matching sun hats are approaching a brick building. One carries a casserole, the other what appears to be a scroll of signatures. Fred peeked through the blinds beside him. "Ah, that's the community center. It's Tuesday. There's usually a town hall meeting or a bake sale by now." Genghis narrowed his eyes. "Is this a council of elders?" "In a way," Fred said, buttering his bagel. "They're part of the neighborhood watch and gardening club. We could stop by if you'd like." Genghis hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If they are leaders, I should meet them." 10 minutes later, Genghis was in full gear, his best tunic, ceremonial sash, borrowed from Fred's curtain tiebacks, and slippers. He refused to leave the house without his sword, which Fred had wrapped in a yoga mat to keep it from alarming passers-by. They walked side by side across the sleepy cul-de-sac, passing flower beds and wind chimes. Fred offered a cheerful wave to a jogger. Genghis offered a nod so sharp it felt like a declaration of intent. The community center was alive with the smells of cinnamon and acrylic paint. Inside, a dozen neighbors milled around tables stacked with flyers, muffins, and craft projects. Genghis paused just past the door. "There are no guards." "No," Fred said. "Just greeters." An elderly woman named Margaret approached with a paper name tag and a bright floral vest. "Welcome. Are you here for the volunteer board or the pancake raffle?" Genghis considered. "I will speak to the council." Margaret beamed. "Oh, you must mean the neighborhood council booth. Right over there, past the embroidery display. And I love your belt. Very authentic." He looked down at the rope of polished bone and horn that hung at his hip. "These are the teeth of my enemies." Margaret paused only briefly. "Oh, we did a dental health seminar last month. You would have loved it." Fred gently guided Genghis toward a table with clipboards and coffee urns. Local council volunteers were seated behind it, chatting about recycling policies and pothole repair. One man with horn-rimmed glasses looked up. "Fred, good to see you. And who's this?" Fred gestured toward his companion. "This is Genghis. He's new to the neighborhood." "Ah," said the man, scanning Genghis's attire. "Period reenactment." "No," Fred said calmly. "Time displacement." The man blinked. "Got it. Well, always room for new voices at our meetings." A stack of pamphlets lay on the table. Genghis picked one up titled "Being a Good Neighbor, Rights, Wrongs, and Recycling Days." He read it as if it were a secret battle code. "We do not separate food waste from dry goods," he muttered. "Then today is a new conquest," Fred said, handing him a complimentary donut. Before they left, a local reporter for the community newsletter snapped a photo. Genghis tried to raise his sword. Fred quickly intercepted with a peace sign. By the time they stepped back outside, Genghis had been invited to participate in the next neighborhood cleanup. he had accepted with a nod that felt like a treaty. "Where to next?" Fred asked. Genghis squinted against the sun. "You spoke yesterday of a place where all knowledge dwells. A house of words." Fred smiled. "The library." The building was quiet, sun filtering through wide windows. A few students studied under skylights. Toddlers shuffled past on a field trip. A librarian with a silver bun gave Fred a familiar wave. They wandered the aisles, Genghis trailing his fingers along book spines like they were blades. "This is a shrine," he whispered. Fred nodded. "In a way. But here, the weapons are stories." Genghis paused by the biography section. He pulled out a thick volume with his own name on it. His face stared back at him on the cover, helmeted, grim, rendered in deep shadow. "This is me," he said. "But I do not remember this painter." "It's a photograph of a statue," Fred explained. "A representation." Genghis flipped through the book, frowning. "I did not say these things." Fred nodded gently. "Sometimes history tells stories about us we didn't choose, but we can still choose what stories we live now." Genghis sat down in a small plastic chair, still holding the book. "Do they write about you?" "Sometimes," Fred said. "But that's not why I speak." They sat in silence for a while, surrounded by whispers and turning pages. Eventually, Genghis pointed to a computer screen and said, "Is this a scroll?" "It's like a magic scroll," Fred replied, "but with cat videos." Later, at the library's puppet story hour, Genghis watched a woman animate a fuzzy dragon for a group of preschoolers. He leaned over and whispered, "This is their elder. She is mighty." Fred smiled. "She reads them stories. And that is enough?" Fred nodded. "Sometimes, yes." Afterward, Genghis approached the puppet theater. The dragon was resting on a box labeled "Property of Miss Janet." Genghis bowed deeply before it. As the day wound down, they sat on a bench outside, watching children play hopscotch. Genghis leaned back, stretching his legs. "Your people do not fear me." "No," Fred said. "They see you." "Not as a threat." Fred shrugged. "As a neighbor, maybe even a friend." The warlord looked up at the sky, softer now in the late afternoon light. "I have ruled, I have marched, I have burned cities for less than an insult," he murmured. Fred folded his hands in his lap. "And yet today you attended a community meeting and learned how to compost banana peels." Genghis grunted. Then he smiled. A small one, but real. The library and the sandbox. The next morning was unusually still. No sprinklers sputtered. No delivery trucks rumbled down the street. Even the golden retriever 2 doors down seemed to be observing a kind of canine Sabbath. Genghis Khan was awake early, though he hadn't truly slept. He had laid motionless most of the night, eyes fixed on the ceiling of Fred's guest room, counting each wooden plank and tracing the strange patterns on the stucco with his imagination. Sleep in this century was too quiet. He missed the distant howl of wolves, the crackle of a fire, the whispered breathing of horses. Fred, as always, was seated in the kitchen with his morning paper and a plate of toast. The jam was plum today. Genghis sat across from him in slippers, armor removed but belt of non-weapons securely fastened. There was a silence between them that wasn't awkward. It was simply shared. Fred folded his paper and looked up. I was thinking we might go to the library today. Genghis blinked. Is this a place of scrolls? Fred nodded. Books, thousands of them, stories, ideas, whole worlds waiting quietly on shelves. Genghis considered this. Do they permit swords? Fred took a bite of toast. Only metaphorical ones. They drove in silence. Fred's sedan hummed along sleepy roads until they pulled up to a modest brick building with a hand-painted sign. Beechwood Public Library. A mural of storybook characters covered one side. Genghis paused at the sight of a grinning cat painted into the brick. It is trapped, he observed. It's just art, Fred said. Then it is dangerous. Inside, the library was cool and smelled faintly of paper, plastic, and lemon floor cleaner. Children darted between shelves. A teenager in earbuds leaned against a beanbag reading a fantasy novel upside down. A librarian with half glasses and infinite patience raised an eyebrow at Genghis's boots, but said nothing. Fred led him to the children's section. Let's start small, he said. Genghis picked up a board book titled Big Red Barn and turned it over carefully, as though expecting it to detonate. He flipped through pages with two thick fingers, eyes narrowing at cartoon animals. The cow smiles, he said. This is suspicious. Fred chuckled. You might prefer non-fiction. They walked through the aisles, passing biographies, history, even cookbooks. Genghis stopped at a shelf marked Myths and Legends. He ran a finger along the spines. These names, Achilles, Gilgamesh, Sun Wukong. He paused. I fought some of these men. Fred smiled. Then you'll find the next part interesting. They sat together at a reading table, light slanting through tall windows. Genghis read silently, lips occasionally moving as he puzzled through words. Fred read beside him, the latest copy of Children and Media Quarterly in hand. Minutes passed, or maybe an hour. Genghis closed the book. They have softened me, he said quietly. Fred looked up. Who? The words. Genghis turned the book toward him. The stories. They bend the heart without breaking the bone. Fred folded his glasses and nodded. Books can do that. They exited the library, not with conquest, but with cards. Genghis now had a laminated library card tucked inside his belt. The sun was higher now, casting warm shadows across the sidewalk. They passed a park. Fred paused. Would you like to stop and play? Genghis looked at him. You wish to train? In a sense, Fred said, pointing to the sandbox. It was mostly empty, save for a toddler in a dinosaur hat and a woman reading a magazine on a nearby bench. Fred stepped onto the sand without ceremony, removed his shoes, and sat cross-legged like it was a tea ceremony. Genghis followed slowly. Fred handed him a small plastic shovel. Genghis examined it like a holy relic. We are digging, he asked. For what? Fred smiled. For joy. So they dug and shaped and built tiny castles in the sand. Genghis used surprising precision, his walls straight and corners reinforced. Fred added a moat and a drawbridge made of popsicle sticks. The toddler waddled over, pointed to a tower Genghis had shaped, and said something unintelligible but approving. Then he smashed it. Genghis stiffened. Fred placed a calming hand on his arm. "He's learning," he said softly. The warlord took a breath. Then another. He looked at the child. He has no respect for fortifications. "Neither did you," Fred said gently. They watched the boy scurry back to his mother, now wearing Genghis's helmet like a turtle shell. Genghis didn't pursue. They sat in the sandbox until the shadows grew long and the breeze carried the scent of barbecues from nearby patios. Fred sighed contentedly. "You know," he said, brushing sand from his pant leg, "peace isn't always quiet. Sometimes it's just knowing you don't need to draw your sword today." Genghis said nothing. He looked at his hands. Sand in the creases. Story dust in his palms. A tiny shovel resting beside a half-crushed tower. And he nodded. "Then I will let this day live." Sweater diplomacy. Fred Rogers stood in front of the open closet, fingers brushing over neatly hung cardigans in every color imaginable. Genghis Khan stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at the orderly row of sweaters like a general surveying enemy banners. "These are your war robes?" Genghis asked. Fred chuckled softly. "I suppose you could say they're my uniforms for kindness." He selected a golden yellow cardigan and slipped it on with the grace of a ritual. It was early evening, and the house was steeped in that syrupy amber light that made everything feel softer, the kind of light that made even a warlord lower his voice. Genghis was still wearing the same cloak he'd arrived in, patched with travel, edged with wear. It smelled faintly of wild wind and smoke, like it carried echoes of campfires across centuries, and yet he looked at the sweaters like they were spell books. "I do not trust garments without armor," he muttered. "Sometimes kindness is the armor," Fred said, "and warmth helps." Genghis didn't reply, but he stepped closer to the rack. Fred, ever attuned, reached for a thick brown cable knit, sturdy, simple, with elbow patches. "This one reminds me of you. I do not wear soft things." "It's quite warm," Fred said, holding it out like a peace offering, "and no one will try to invade you while wearing it, I promise." After a pause, Genghis took the sweater. He stared at it, turned it over. He held it up against his chest like one might judge the weight of a sword. Finally, wordlessly, he began to put it on. The sleeves were a bit long, the shoulders snug. But when he looked in the mirror, he didn't hate it. Fred smiled. Very neighborly. Genghis grunted. "I look like a poet." "Maybe you are one," Fred said, walking toward the kitchen. "In disguise." They made tea. Or rather, Fred made tea while Genghis stared suspiciously at the kettle as it whistled. "It screams," he observed. "It's excited," Fred replied gently, pouring the water. They sat at the kitchen table, a modest oak piece with scratches from years of gentle use. The kind of table where important conversations had taken place, not with shouts, but with listening. "I once had a council," Genghis said. "We gathered around fire pits, plotted conquests, settled betrayals with blades or blood." Fred stirred his tea. "We have councils too. Ours involve school boards and letters to the editor. Genghis tilted his head. And if someone offends you, we have dialogue, and sometimes muffins. A pause. I prefer blades, Genghis said. Fred took a sip. So did I once. That made the warlord blink. In the Navy, Fred clarified. Before television, I wore a uniform, saluted, fired rifles. I understand the allure of force. Genghis leaned in. And why did you change? Fred looked out the window for a moment, watching a bird hop along the fence. Because I learned that a well-timed question could be sharper than a sword. Later that evening, Fred retrieved a dusty box from the hallway closet. These, he said, placing it on the coffee table, are letters. From children, over the years. Genghis lifted the lid like it might contain relics. Inside, hundreds of envelopes, crayon drawings, misspelled notes, hearts drawn in clumsy but sincere loops. They write to you, he asked, bewildered. All the time, Fred said. They tell me about their dreams, their fears, their pets, sometimes their grief. Genghis picked up one. A blue envelope with a glittery sticker of a dolphin. Inside was a note in blocky handwriting. Dear Mr. Rogers, I'm scared my dog won't come back. He ran away and my mom said he might not. But I feel better when you say it's okay to feel sad. Genghis read it twice. Then again, his brow furrowed. In my time, he said slowly, children did not write to warlords. They were trained, tested, hardened. Fred nodded. They still face trials. But sometimes they just need someone to tell them their feelings matter. Genghis placed the letter back in the box with surprising care. The child will be a strong chieftain one day. Fred led him to the living room window. Outside, twilight had begun to fall, shadows lengthening across trimmed lawns and plastic flamingos. In one house across the street, lights flickered on, illuminating a father and child setting the table together. There's a kind of power here too, Fred said softly, not the kind that raises empires, but the kind that holds them together. Genghis crossed his arms. We did not have flamingos. Fred chuckled. You would have liked them. They're a bit theatrical. They stood in companionable silence. One man a weaver of worlds through television, the other a weaver of bloodlines through conquest. And yet the quiet was mutual, earned. That night they sat on the back porch, a small lamp casting a pool of light around them. Fred played a cassette on a small tape recorder, soft jazz, slow and undemanding. Genghis had removed the cardigan. It lay folded beside him like a truce flag. He was sipping tea again, this time with less suspicion. Do you miss your time? Fred asked. The warlord didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the stars. They were simpler and crueler. The world listened when I raised my hand. Now it hums without me. Fred sipped his tea. It still listens, just with different ears. Genghis nodded. You fight with puppets and patience. And yet, people write to you. They do not fear you, but they follow you. I don't want followers, Fred said quietly. I want neighbors. Genghis looked down at his hands. the same hands that had ordered raids, cradled dying friends, and now held a porcelain teacup with a cartoon owl on the side. "Maybe I do too," he said. Just before bed, Fred handed Genghis a notebook. "For your thoughts," he said. "I do not write poems," Genghis muttered. "No pressure," Fred replied. "But if you ever feel something you can't conquer, write it down. Sometimes naming a feeling is half the battle." Genghis flipped open the first page. Inside was written, "Today I wore soft armor and spoke no threats. A small tiger believed in me, so I believed in him." He stared at it, then closed the notebook with a nod. "I will call it my book of campaigns." Fred smiled. "That sounds just right." The Parade of Peace and Pine Cones. The sign went up 3 weeks after the library incident. "Neighborhood Day Parade, this Saturday." Hand-painted with crooked stars and crookeder lettering, it was hung with duct tape to the community board by the rec center. Fred spotted it first and smiled. Genghis saw it second and frowned. "What is parade?" Genghis asked, tapping the poster like it owed him an explanation. Fred folded his arms softly. "It's a celebration, a walk through the neighborhood. There are streamers, costumes, music." Genghis narrowed his eyes. "And horses?" "Well, no, not usually." "Siege weapons?" "Definitely not." Genghis grunted. "Then who marches?" "Anyone who wants to, especially children. It's a way for them to feel proud of who they are and where they live." "Parading with no conquest." Genghis rubbed his chin, genuinely baffled. "This is curious." Fred knew that look. That was the look Genghis had when he discovered seatbelts, or shoelaces, or that microwaves were not tiny blacksmith ovens. "Would you like to join us?" Fred asked. The warlord looked down at his socks. One was slightly unraveling at the toe. "Do they allow warlords with footholds?" Fred smiled. "Especially those." By Thursday, plans were in full swing. The neighborhood buzzed like a hive of polite arts and crafts bees. Cardboard floats were being painted in driveways. Homemade instruments were tuned to approximate human harmony. Someone built a 12-foot papier-mâché goose, which, according to the creator, represented unity, migration, and also because they had leftover beak paint from Halloween. Fred prepared a modest float, a red wagon adorned with sunflowers, and a banner that read, "Kindness Grows." Inside, a stuffed Daniel the Tiger sat beside a basket of pine cones painted gold. "Symbolic," Fred explained. Genghis inspected one of the pine cones suspiciously. "In my land, we use these to smoke meat." "Here," Fred replied with a wink. "We use them to smoke cynicism." It was Genghis's job to carry the banner at the front. He took this role very seriously. He requested a pole fashioned from oak, no birch bends when challenged, and tied the banner himself with knots so elaborate a local Boy Scout fainted just looking at them. On the morning of the parade, Genghis emerged from Fred's house wearing a repurposed marching band sash, 2 gold pine cones strapped to his belt like ceremonial daggers, and a determined squint. Fred, in a cardigan patterned with balloons, carried a paper cup of lemonade and hummed softly. The parade began like all great moments in history, with confusion, enthusiasm, and someone starting the music too early. Genghis took the lead, holding the Beechwood Neighbors Unite banner aloft like a royal standard. Behind him followed kids on decorated scooters, parents with bubble wands, a dog dressed as a recycling bin, and two elderly women dressed as the moon and sun, respectively. Fred walked near the middle, offering high fives, hugs, and lemonade refills. Genghis did not wave. He surveyed. Every face was a potential ally. Every front lawn a potential hill to defend. Every sprinkler an untrustworthy contraption of sorcery. But as the parade passed Mrs. Higginbotham's house, where she had set out a tray of oatmeal cookies and a hand-painted sign that read, "Go Fred, go," something strange happened. Genghis smiled. It was small, brief, but real. He turned to Fred. "Your people are very decorative." Fred grinned. "They like to be seen. But more than that, they like to be known." Halfway down the block, the parade was halted by a rogue marching band from the next neighborhood over. They had also scheduled a parade. They had brass, uniforms. One kid had a tuba big enough to fit a mid-sized librarian. A woman named Patty, dressed as a mailbox, panicked. "What do we do? This is a parade off." Fred approached their leader calmly, a teenager with gelled hair and too much ambition. "We'd be happy to share the route," Fred offered. "There's enough sunshine for everyone." The teen snorted. "This is Cedar Hills territory." Fred blinked. "We thought this was Beechwood." A pause. Genghis stepped forward, eyes flinting. Fred held up a hand. "No war declarations, please." Genghis lowered his pine cones. The tension melted when a toddler on a tricycle rolled through the standoff, holding a sign that read, "Love is louder than tubas." Everyone laughed. The teens agreed to a joint parade. The parade resumed. By the final block, the energy had shifted. What had started as a sleepy neighborhood celebration had become something else. The blending of floats, children, cookies, and cultures created a moving mosaic of joy. A woman handed Genghis a balloon shaped like a sword. He stared at it, confused. "This blade has no bite." "It's safer that way," Fred said. Near the finish line, a girl tugged Genghis's sleeve. "Are you really Genghis Khan?" He looked down. "I am." "Did you used to be scary?" He paused. "Yes," he admitted. "I was very good at being scary." The girl handed him a sticker. It said, "Today I shared." Genghis stuck it on his chest like a medal. The parade ended at the park. Families sat on blankets. Sandwiches were unpacked. Music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker that Fred called the Box of Invisible Minstrels. Genghis stood beneath a cherry tree, hands clasped behind his back. Fred joined him, sipping juice from a thermos. "You did well," Fred said. "I did not shout," Genghis said proudly. "Not even once." "You carried peace." "I carried cloth," Genghis corrected. "But it had peaceful words." "That's a start." They watched the clouds roll slowly overhead. Somewhere, someone was blowing bubbles. Somewhere else, laughter danced between trees. Genghis exhaled. "This world is very soft." Fred smiled. It is, but sometimes softness can endure longer than steel. The sun dipped lower. Children napped in laps. Neighbors swapped stories. The marching band teens, now slightly less cool, handed out juice boxes. Genghis sat down on the grass. Fred sat beside him. They said nothing for a long while. And in that silence, with pine cones glinting on his belt and a sticker on his chest, the conqueror of nations rested not as a warlord, but as a neighbor. And somehow it felt like the greatest victory of all. The final broadcast. It began with a whisper, not from a person, but from the living room radio. It crackled one Tuesday evening just after dinner, as Fred was washing dishes and Genghis was methodically stabbing a sponge into submission. We repeat, cosmic irregularity is stabilizing. Anomaly may reverse. Coordinates. Fred dried his hands and turned the volume up. The broadcast continued in a haze of static and jargon, but the message, once filtered through the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the knowing glance shared between friends, became clear. Genghis might not be staying forever. They didn't talk about it right away. Instead, they played cards that night. A quiet game of Go Fish, in which Genghis accused Fred of card-based deception, and Fred accused Genghis of holding too many cards in his sleeves. When they went to bed, Genghis sat on the edge of the guest room cot and stared at the ceiling. "Fred," he called softly. "Yes." "If I vanish, will the fish remember me?" Fred smiled from the hallway. "They'll miss your feeding technique." "And the girl with the sticker. She'll tell stories about the soft-spoken warrior with the terrifying posture and the gentle thumbs." "Silence. Will you remember me?" Fred stepped into the doorway. Cardigan sleeves pushed up, eyes soft. "Always." The next morning, Fred found Genghis out front, standing barefoot in the dew-soaked grass, looking at the sky. He held Daniel the tiger in one hand and a juice box in the other. "I do not wish to leave," Genghis said plainly. Fred nodded. "Sometimes, even when we don't want things to end, we still have to let them." Genghis took a sip of juice. "I did not bite the box this time. I noticed." He turned to Fred. "Is there a way to stay?" Fred looked out at the quiet street. The breeze, the trimmed hedges, the faint smell of toast. "There's always a way to leave a piece of yourself behind," he said. Genghis tilted his head. "Like a molted snake?" Fred chuckled. "Sort of." That day, they began preparing. Genghis chose 3 things to leave behind. His conical helmet, which he placed atop the bookshelf between a photo of Fred and a miniature trolley. A pine cone, painted gold, nestled in a flower pot near the porch. A hand-drawn map of the neighborhood, complete with battle notes and hearts drawn over the bakery. "I've conquered the muffin route," he explained. Fred, for his part, compiled a scrapbook. Every photo they'd taken, every drawing from local kids, every juice box wrapper that hadn't been chewed. "I call it the tale of 2 slippers," Fred said. Genghis blinked. "I only lost one." "Creative license," Fred replied. That evening, the neighborhood gathered one last time. It wasn't called a farewell. It was called Evening Under the Stars. There were lanterns, cookies, blankets spread out across the lawn. Someone played guitar. Someone else brought a telescope. Genghis sat at the center of it all, a child in his lap, pointing at constellations. "That one?" the boy asked. "That is the goat archer," Genghis declared. "I think that's Capricorn," the boy replied. "We called him Steve." Fred leaned over. "Who?" "The goat archer." Fred smiled. "Of course." Later, as the stars brightened and the air turned cooler, Fred stood up and tapped a spoon to a teacup. "I'd like to say something," he began. The murmurs quieted. The neighbors leaned in. "This world is full of surprises," Fred said. "Some gentle, some loud, some wear sweaters, and some wear wolf fur and carry swords." A ripple of laughter. "But the biggest surprise, always, is how easily kindness fits between even the widest of differences. We've had a visitor, a friend, a warrior who became a neighbor. And no matter where he goes next, he has changed our neighborhood forever." He turned. "Thank you, Genghis." Genghis stood slowly. "I have never been given a parade," he said. "Not one without drums of war, not one with balloons." He looked around at the faces, the soft lamps, the sleepy children. "You showed me there is more than conquest. That power is not only in the sword, it is in listening, in waving, in choosing not to bite the juice box." He raised his hand in salute, half military, half wave. "I will not forget." The sky shimmered just past midnight. It was subtle, like a sigh, a ripple of time stitched back together by some unseen hand. Fred and Genghis stood in the backyard, side by side. "You know," Fred said, "every time we say goodbye, we also say, 'Thank you for being here.'" Genghis looked at him. "I was." Fred extended his hand. Genghis gripped it with quiet reverence. And then, light, like morning and memory and electricity all at once. When it faded, the backyard was quiet. Just Fred. Just the soft chirp of crickets and the gold pine cone on the porch. The weeks passed. Fred mowed the lawn, fed the fish, visited the bakery. A postcard arrived from Mongolia. It had no return address. It simply read, "The goat archer lives." Fred pinned it next to the trolley. And in the hearts of the neighborhood, in the secret smiles and shared stories, Genghis Khan remained. Not as a warrior, not as a conqueror, but as the neighbor who learned to wave. The porch light still glows. Some friendships are loud. Some ride in on horses. Others arrive with a knock or no warning at all. This one came in the form of a warlord, lost in time, found in kindness. Fred never kept a journal of their days together, though he probably could have. But sometimes memory is softer when unwritten, like a slipper on a rainy afternoon, or a juice box with no teeth marks. He would still glance at the bookshelf, at the helmet, still water the porch flower pot, where the golden pine cone gleamed, still hear the echo of a sword tapping a cereal bowl. Some nights he'd sit on the porch, cardigan sleeves pushed up, hands wrapped around a warm cup, and he'd look at the stars. Somewhere out there, a goat archer danced across the sky. And maybe, just maybe, a warrior waved back. The porch light stayed on, just in case. Because once you've shared a neighborhood with Genghis Khan, you learn there's no such thing as too unlikely a friend, only stories waiting to be told.